This is the panel discussion on infrastructure service delivery innovations for future resilience. My name is Heather Loebner. I am a consultant around sustainability, philanthropy, and conservation, and really thrilled to be with all of you today. Kind of following up to the last note of the presentation that we just heard, I'm going to moderate this panel. I have the pleasure of moderating this panel with a corporate perspective, having come from sectors like HSBC, which is banking, and ArcelorMittal, which is steel manufacturing and mining. So very different footprints. So hopefully our panel will present a bit of that. So I'm going to introduce our panel, and we're going to work in much the same format as the last panel. Okay, so Rajan is Vice President of RD&E with Global Sustainability Tech Leader at Ecolab. Next, we have Abutaleb, who's President and CEO of UltiSat. Joannes Westerink, who's Professor and Department Chair, Civil and Environmental Engineering and Earth Sciences at University of Notre Dame. And then, lastly, Gary Lawrence, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of AECOM. So we will start with you, Raj.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a little bit, tell you a little bit about Ecolab and what we do and how it relates to climate change, just to provide the context of my comments. We are a business-to-business organization that's present in 171 countries, so I think that leaves like 5 or 6 of them on the table. And it's the whole climate change context for us from a private sector perspective is all about what we do and where we do it. And by where we do it, I'm not talking about the countries, so I'll elaborate a little bit. We are in the business of industrial hygiene, public health, infection prevention, and interestingly, heat transfer in the industrial context, which is heating or cooling of water for practically every industrial operation and commercial operation. And also in the business of increasing the productivity of energy production and energy refining. And if you think about it, clean water, food safety, infection prevention, energy reliability, these are all potential vulnerabilities associated with climate change. And practically every service we provide to the industrial and institutional sector cannot be achieved without water. We cannot clean, sanitize, heat, cool, or push oil and gas out of the ground without water. And so if water becomes a bottleneck, and often we think about this in the context of human consumption, water for agriculture, water for food processing, but water is essentially the mobile force for practically every activity of commerce. And if that becomes a bottleneck, commerce comes to a grinding halt, and if it comes to a grinding halt, we as a B2B organization come to a grinding halt. And that is our vested interest in terms of the handling not just the risk, but actually being able to deliver the opportunity, see the opportunity and actually deliver outcomes based on that. And I loved Juan's comment about compassion is not compassion if you can't deliver the outcome, if the impact isn't there. And same thing, social responsibility stated in abstract by private sector doesn't mean anything if it doesn't deliver the outcome that is needed or desired the most in various geographies where we and our customers operate in. Interestingly, when I mentioned the subject, the infrastructure, to some of my people on my team, they said, infrastructure, what are you talking about? What do we do that is infrastructure? And I want to throw a different twist on this. Refer to it as virtual or soft infrastructure. And this happens to be infrastructure that is a lot less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and extreme weather patterns. Think of it this way. Anytime we help the industrial sector or institutional sector reduce their water use, we are essentially creating virtual water treatment plants within their operations. Anytime we help an industry mine its own gray water and reuse it for utility water, we are actually creating a water facility that is not made of concrete and steel and that cannot be wiped out by a hurricane or a typhoon or anything else. So it is actually water efficiency in the context of commercial and industrial operations is actually water infrastructure that is a lot more resistant and lot more resilient in the context of climate change than any water treatment plant we can build. And I'm speaking, Juan knows this, I'm an engineer. And I went into, got a civil engineering degree to build the concrete and steel bridges and water treatment plants. But if you think about virtual infrastructure, so service-driven virtual infrastructure, and the same thing applies to energy. If you can start conserving energy, besides the fact that often there is DOE talks about this, many businesses talk about it, there's a lot of money to be had. Energy conservation actually pays, because now you're not spending money to generate that energy, you're tackling the demand side. But again, just like the water analogy, if you're delivering energy efficiency in a very large scale, then what you're actually doing is building a power plant within the customer's fences that again cannot get wiped out by some extreme weather event. So think of it in terms of that resilience. It also applies to other resources, not just energy and water. For example, think of the conventional energy production sector, whether it is oil or natural gas. If we can produce more oil or gas from the same wells, or whether it is offshore platforms or wells inland, then there are less offshore platforms we have to put out there that might be exposed to the elements and that can get impacted. So besides the resource conservation story, I want to point out that when you think about eco-efficiency, resource conservation, energy conservation, water conservation, it is actually the most resilient form of infrastructure you can provide for any human activity, because nothing is there to get wiped out or get taken away that needs to be rebuilt. So that is the context in which we come in. And there is another, putting my science hat on, the RD&E, the research, development, and engineering, one aspect that I have learned from the microbiological point of view is anytime, almost all food we consume is organic in nature. So as temperatures rise around the world, food breaks down a lot quicker. So food spoils, food that's grown is not available. Globally, the recent FAO report said that almost 40% of the food that's grown never gets consumed by a human. The issues are different in mature markets. In geographies that are less vulnerable to climate change, the issue is more an issue of behavior modification. In the US, for example, almost 40% of the food that gets thrown away post-retail. So the grocery store thinking that the food doesn't look good enough to sell, or people going to restaurants and ordering more food than they eat and throwing it away, people bringing more food home from the grocery store and not cooking it and throwing it away. In emerging markets, the most vulnerable geographies of the world, most of the food spoilage happens between the farm and retail. It's not a question of behavior modification. It's actually a question of lack of infrastructure. In India, for example, grows 3 times the food that gets consumed. And while a lot of the technological hat people put on and say, oh, let's increase the food yield, let's grow more food in the same area, let's use GMOs, let's improve drip irrigation, all that might be part of the mix, right? But the reality is, if that food that's grown doesn't spoil because of the lack of warehousing, lack of refrigeration, lack of transportation logistics, you do not have to focus on growing more food. You can focus on delivering more food to people that is already grown. So you're not going to have the other environmental impact with nutrients and leaching and water quality impacts from runoff and all those land use issues that come with more intensive agricultural practices. So we tend to think of it that way. In the public health space, the way we are looking at it in terms of adaptation, when you have extreme temperatures, microbiology, most pathogens, most microorganisms that cause disease tend to go into spore formation to protect themselves. Spores are a lot more difficult to get rid of and protect people from. They survive through all kinds of harsh chemical environments, and then they expose people to disease and infection. So from that context, again, climate change increases the challenges of infection prevention, both from a waterborne illness and a foodborne illness point of view. So that's my starting point, just to set the stage for not just looking at something like an energy-water nexus, but a water nexus with food, with energy, and with public health.
Great. Mo, would you like to go next, please?
Sure. Thank you, Heather, and thank you to ND again for participating in this invitation to participate in this panel, and to Juan Jose for the invitation. Thank you very much. Mo Abutaleb with UltiSat, and UltiSat, let's give a little bit of a background similar to what Raj did for his company. UltiSat is in the satellite communications business. We focus on delivering really end-to-end network solutions, technologies that enable government agencies, NGOs, some multinational corporations, and so on, to be able to connect really in very difficult, remote, harsh territories. So climate change, which is the focus of this whole venue, is a big deal for us in the satellite communications business. It's satellite communications, by the nature of it, really is a more reactive than proactive. We are proactive to some extent in this arena, but generally it's a reactive type of thing in which when there's catastrophe, when natural disasters occur and so on, satellite communications has become kind of the de facto approach technology for restoration of service. I mean, we've all gotten accustomed to the fact that the world, as we know it, can't go. We can't do commerce. We can't do any basic day-to-day living without telecom. So once you have air and water and some food and power, telecom resiliency is probably next in the chain of events in terms of the need to have the ability to keep up and restore services and so on. So I'm going to walk down the 4 or 5 points that Joyce kind of passed out as discussion points, and just try to hit upon them real quickly. First, having to do with innovative approaches to infrastructure resiliency. I mean, again, this is really what satellite communication is all about. ICT, information and communications technology, and the lack of that in the case of an adverse event that wipes out ICT infrastructure. This is really where satellite communications enters the picture and provides that resiliency. It can come in one of 2 forms, either for some of those countries that are high up on the gain index, they will have had the forethought to look at resiliency and look at ways to overcome potential issues with their telecom infrastructure. In most countries of the world, the big telecom infrastructure is based on landline terrestrial fiber connectivity. That kind of is the lifeline of telecom from a broadband and connectivity perspective. In some cases, cellular infrastructure also provides part of that infrastructure. Those are both very apt to be wiped out. You know, in the case of like what happened in the Philippines, or Sandy in the case of New York City. So what we try to do with some of the countries that are high up on the gain index is actually go to them and offer resiliency options so that they can withstand the effects of these types of natural disasters when they take place. In the case of those that are kind of lower on the index, which are the unfortunate ones in this case, and really are the ones that generally don't provide the opportunity for forethought, is you try to place enough assets in a forward deployed manner to be able to react to events if they take place, especially if there's any type of advance notice, perhaps days or weeks in advance, where you have the opportunity to deploy some assets so that you can react when the event does hit. So from my perspective, satellite communications really is the innovative approach to resiliency when it comes to telecom infrastructure in some of these in these markets. We work quite a bit with NGOs, especially the United Nations, in terms of humanitarian efforts, in terms of in terms of relief efforts and in terms of even monitoring networks. One of the agencies that we work with actually is involved in environmental monitoring and treaty compliance for certain types of treaty issues. In that specific sphere, satellite communications can be very, very useful as a proactive tool for, in the case of providing advance notice of events, or for providing data to scientists who can take that data and be able to forecast, perhaps with pretty good accuracy, a potential disaster before it strikes, so that you can then use that data to for relief efforts or evacuation or infrastructure resiliency before the event actually occurs. So from that perspective, I think satellite communications provides an innovative approach to resiliency and recovery. Unfortunately, satellite communications is really, not unfortunately, but the fact of life is satellite communications really cataclysmic events and disasters are really business drivers for satellite communications. That's the truth be told, that is the case. So in the case of catastrophes, like in the Philippines, like war-torn areas in Southwest Asia and the Middle East, and even New York City in the case of Hurricane Sandy, that is a business driver for satellite communications. That's not necessarily where you make your margins, but it's certainly an area that we keep close eye on and try to monitor in order to be able to be productive in that field. The deployment of, just to give you a quick overview of how this works, is in the case of an event, we can typically be on the ground same day and generally within a half an hour be up and running with some level of connectivity that enables then aid agencies to begin the work on the ground and be able to initiate, recovery and relief efforts. Relative to contribution in the growth in infrastructure business over the next 5 years, another talking point that we were asked to kind of address here. I think satellite communications has a big role to play in helping to bridge the digital divide as we go forward in time here. Especially Eastern Europe and Asian countries are investing heavily, governments are investing heavily in trying to bridge that digital divide, and the most natural and cost-effective way to address, for example, bringing education to rural communities that don't have the density to justify cost-effectively laying fiber, out to these very, very remote areas, the very heavy cost base for extending a terrestrial network out to rural areas. Well, the next best thing, quite frankly, is something like satellite communications, where we can go in and work with mobile phone operators to be able to extend out from the densely populated areas into these lightly populated areas without having to trench and provide for fiber cable across thousands of miles. So it's a very cost-effective way to help governments and local terrestrial and cellular operators extend their reach out into rural communities and bridge that digital divide. So again, we work with those countries that are high up on the gain index, as well as those further down on the gain index, to try to have the forward deployed assets, the resilient infrastructure, and so on, to help them hopefully get higher and higher on the index. So with that, I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Joannes?
Okay, thanks. I'll frame my involvement a little bit. I'm the co-developer of a computer model called AdCirc. It's used by FEMA to establish the flood insurance rate maps, as well as by the Army Corps of Engineers to design levees. The recent rebuilding of the levees in New Orleans was based on our model, as well as by NOAA and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Joyce asked me to frame a little bit the impact of hurricanes in a changing climate on infrastructure, and I'm going to try to, in a little bit of a nutshell, give some of my thoughts in terms of where that should be going. One very important factor is that hurricanes are very low probability events. but have huge impact and huge consequences. And I think the low probability aspect is an important factor in terms of trying to understand them as well as planning for them. In terms of cost of lives, destroyed or damaged infrastructure, and the associated economic impact, they're obviously amongst the biggest natural disasters in terms of devastation. But particularly for industrial properties and shipping and transportation sector, hurricanes are the number one most impactful natural disasters. So it really it has an impact on the economy as well as millions and millions of people. Hurricanes are very multifaceted events. There's not only the winds, which of course leads to some level of trouble and damage and death, but especially the storm surge, which is the high water, but it's also the currents and the wind waves that affect it. And those vary dramatically and depending on where you are geographically and what the storm looks like. Just to give you an idea, a wind wave during a hurricane is as large as 30 meters from trough to peak. So it's huge in the deep ocean. Hurricanes cause tremendous damage on offshore infrastructure. It's not well known, but obviously the energy infrastructure is tremendously damaged, causing huge insurance losses. The coastal floodplain and deltaic rivers, and their impact is not just coastal, it can penetrate as much as 100 kilometers inland. Deltas are especially vulnerable. They are the major focal points of shipping and industry, and also happen to be very large and high density population centers. And again, these are very, very vulnerable areas. I think a number of factors really come into play in terms of understanding risk of hurricanes. I'd say my biggest message is that hurricane risk is still hugely misunderstood. There's a lot of poor concepts, and even if they're not only misunderstood, but they're also they're ignored largely. And people tend to base their risk assessment on memory and a lot of misinformation. The Saffir-Simpson scale being number one on the list, it's an incredibly poor indicator of storm surge, yet has been used for decades and decades as an indicator of what the storm surge is going to be. You only need to look at Hurricane Sandy to know that that's very incorrect. Another factor is as frequency decreases, preparedness and resiliency decreases as well, but the impact increases once a hurricane does strike. And again, I think Cuba is a very nice example of that. Cuba is very well prepared for hurricanes. They have several hurricanes that come by the island and impact most of the island every year, and they're very well prepared because of that frequency. Hurricane impact is related to the geographic configuration of the coast and floodplain. It's very important what the area looks like in detail. The general geographic location, which really factors into storm structure and frequency, and the particular structure of the storm, including especially the size, the total kinetic energy, the track, and the forward speed. There's been huge advances in computing technologies, obviously, over the last 4 or 5 decades, but especially the last 2 decades. And we now actually have the tools in hand and the models in hand to really forecast the impact of a specific hurricane and to understand the physical processes. Some problems do remain, and that again gets back to the frequency. We really need to understand the types of storms and their frequency, not only in a changing climate, but in a static climate. We only have about 60 years of good data in terms of what hurricanes have done in the past. Probably a little bit, if you extend it out and stretch it, maybe 100, 120 years or so. That's not very much in terms of understanding the potential hurricanes and how big they can. And then you add to that the changing climate and the energy feeders of a warmer ocean and changing meteorological conditions. So the questions are really, how much bigger can they get in terms of total kinetic energy? How much more intense can they get, and will they get more frequent? So those are largely unknown questions right now. A few comments on resiliency and risk mitigation. Some very broad concepts to consider are that some regions are consistently more prone to hurricanes than others. New Orleans is a great example. it's about twice as likely to have a major hurricane come and strike or make landfall nearby than, let's say, the central coast of Texas, which is in turn about twice to 3 times as likely to have a hurricane hit compared to the West Florida shelf. So there's large-scale regional probabilities that one can certainly assign. But within a region, the storm surge can vary very consistently and substantially. And so you go 10 miles away, for example, you cross from the east bank of New Orleans to the west bank, and your probability of a certain flood level increases by about a factor of 2, i.e., you might want to design a 100-year storm for about 24 feet in eastern New Orleans. On the west bank, it's probably around 12 or 14 feet. Surge can penetrate hugely inland. Hurricane Ike is a great example of that. Houston was hugely impacted by the hurricane. It's more than 100 kilometers inland. Wave action is a hugely destructive element of hurricanes, so we really need to take that into account. Some things in a bigger picture that we need to consider in terms of hurricanes is man's impact on hurricane storm surge and the environment. We just continually change the system with our activities, but we really need to plan for that. For example, channel dredging opens up a conduit for storm surge and tides. The Port of Hamburg is a great example of that. Changing wetlands. If you eliminate the trees in wetland systems, you eliminate the canopy and therefore allow the wind to effectively push water towards land. Louisiana, most of the cypress forests have been cut down for wood and for chips for people's gardens. There's lots of poorly conceived levees and dikes, which actually increase storm surge and amplify it and capture it. There's a wonderful example in the Mississippi River, which captures very effectively storm surge in its southern extent, the way that the levees have been designed. Also, I want to just comment that poor levees can actually give a false sense of security and the increase of vulnerability of the population to when that large event does come by. So a couple of closing comments and on the levels of resiliency and risk mitigation. First of all, on a property level, I think you can make some very reasonable decisions on where to build and how to build. Obviously, you build up high, you build so flow can go through, and this is true for tsunamis as well, and you build sufficiently strongly to sustain and handle the wind, the waves, and the currents. Infrastructure planning on a community level, again, where do you expand your city? Unfortunately, coastal cities often start out on high land and expand into lower land, but certainly you can make some very smart choices in terms of that local variability of storm surge potential. And how do you design the power, water, sewage, telecom, and roads to sustain a hurricane? Again, Sandy is a great example of that none of that stuff was very thoughtfully done at all and never really considered. The flood protection infrastructure in of itself needs to be considered carefully as well. How do you mitigate the impact of the flood protection infrastructure, and really the current trend and current thoughts are to work with nature. Lastly, communicating risk. We want to understand the risk in a changing climate. We certainly want to build analysis tools that are accessible. Right now, the tools that we have in the United States are hugely computationally expensive. They require the biggest supercomputers around. We want to make that available and accessible to the entire world. And we want to communicate that risk and the fact that it's actually better to build with resiliency in mind than to deal with the destruction. There's some great examples of that. The United States, actually, we have a 1 in 100 year floodplain definition, and that means that basically we don't consider that we really live in a floodable area in terms of all the economic investment as well as people buying insurance, et cetera, in terms of that level of protection. I find that interesting because, of course, if you live somewhere your entire life, it's more likely than not that you're going to see a flood, versus the Netherlands, where the design level is 1 in 10,000 years, so quite a difference. In India, storms have been enormously devastating. There's been hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed in historical hurricanes. There has been a concerted effort over the last decade to design vertical evacuation systems. Every public building along the coast is up about, I think, 13 or 14 feet. And that has worked out enormously well, as is witnessed by the last major hurricane that hit this year. Industry, I think, is also making some very progressive moves. In addition to all the government agencies that we work for, we work closely with FM Global, a big mutual insurance company, industrial insurance company, and they actually have several thousand field engineers that work with their clients to actually build in resiliency to their industrial properties, which are, of course, often coastally located. Last, I want to just sow the seed that policy, unfortunately, particularly on the state level, often seems to be politically driven and not science driven. I think, again, the Netherlands, the scientists and engineers seem to be the drivers of public policy related to coastal resiliency, building codes, et cetera. And that's something I think that really wants to be done here as well.
Gary?
Hi, I'm Gary Lawrence. I work for AECOM. AECOM is a $8.5 billion company, 45,000 people around the world, and we are an infrastructure company. And I find this discussion to be very interesting, and I'm learning a lot. I also want to say that Juan Jose recruited me early on as a GAIN disciple, and I've forever since then been thankful for that, getting to know him and getting to know about these issues a little better. I was also given a set of questions, but I find that they're in a different notebook than I brought. So I'm going to talk to you about a few things. First of all, one of the questions that came up in the earlier panel is the role of the private sector and why the private sector should care about the index. And in the most crass form, what the index could inform the private sector is where there are problems to be solved and where there's money to solve those problems. But that's the least important part of it. What it does is actually provide the private sector opportunities to see where investment can be made and risk reduction can occur at the same time. As I said, we have 45,000 people around the world in 110 countries. One of our obligations is to make sure that they live in safe places and work in safe places. So that the index is really helpful to us in actually identifying where we actually need to have offices and where we need to pull offices out simply because the risk associated with our workforce. I'm going to talk about a few things. First of all, I really enjoyed the film that opened. And I enjoyed it because I saw two things that were particularly relevant to risk reduction, adaptation, resilience, and parts of my life. There was a picture of Seattle. There, you might have seen the Space Needle. Well, I was the planning director of the city of Seattle when an earthquake occurred and the Alaskan Way viaduct was damaged. And a decision was made that it had to be taken down. And the first approach was to actually do a cut and cover tunnel along the waterfront of Seattle to replace the viaduct, because that land the viaduct is on is actually the most economically valuable land in the entire state of Washington. That discussion was taking place without any consideration of sea level rise. So the air vents that were designed actually would be inflow pipes to the tunnel with a 1.5 meter rise in sea level and surge. So there was consideration given to that, and that's why now uphill there's a tunnel a bored tunnel as opposed to cut and cover, because somebody asked the question, well, what happens if sea level rises? The state wasn't asking that question. It was an atmospheric scientist at the University of Washington who wrote an editorial about that. And then I actually saw a picture of the building I live in, next to the World Trade Center in Battery Park City in New York. I've lived there for almost 3 years, and I've been evacuated twice. The biggest evacuation, of course, was associated with Superstorm Sandy. Now, all the power was shut down south of 39th Street in Manhattan. My office is on the north side of 39th Street, so we had power, and it was just dark the whole way south, except for my neighborhood. And my neighborhood was built on top of the fill that was excavated for the World Trade Center site, when it was first built, and it was mounded up so that even though Sandy wiped out all of Wall Street, took down the power, the phones, and all that sort of stuff, our buildings never got wet. We never lost power, which is an indication that through sheer luck, something was learned for the city of New York that is now being applied to a master plan to actually raise an area across the southern end of Manhattan. So you create a residential neighborhood that is part of a storm surge system, as opposed to thinking of the surge as just being separate. One other thing about Sandy, there was a real rush to judgment by the governor that, driven by the private sector wanting to sell something, that what we needed in response was surge barriers, big surge barriers underneath sort of shutting off the entire harbor from the ocean. Incredibly expensive, probably would have taken 25 years to get the permits. And it made the assumption that storm surge was actually going to be the way that the city got flooded in the future. And it didn't take into account that it was just as likely that Sandy would have come in at a different angle and parked over New Jersey and filled all the riverine systems and flooded from that way, and the surge barriers would have had no positive effect at all. So as we think about these infrastructure questions, we have to ask ourselves things that are more robust. And I think that the private sector, in terms of trying to sell things, can sometimes compromise good thinking as we move forward. Now, I say that I've worked in cities, I've worked in NGOs. There's nothing inherently evil about the private sector, but we have to make money. So we might be pushing solutions that we know how to provide when the index and the people working on the index might inform the conversation in a different way so that better answers actually come forward. I was talking to the chairman of Swiss Re about New Orleans. One of these things that I'm really good at is misunderstanding the point. And I was talking with him about claims related to the hurricane in New Orleans. And I made the assumption that most of the claims were property claims. And he said, no, over 60% of the claims were related to business continuity. The convention industry had to shut down, and so there's all sorts of litigation about that and those sorts of things. So when we think about resilience, we think also about how it relates to our business continuity. And we also think about how we can change our conversation with our clients so that they take the continuity issues into account as well. Because when it comes down to it, whether we're working for the government or for the private sector, we can only do what they'll let us do. We can only do what they'll pay us to do. And so we actually are engaged in a big effort to change the conversation with all of our clients, most of whom are really committed to the idea of mitigation, to start taking adaptation more and more into account. And it's difficult. It's difficult because the opportunity cost associated with investing in adaptation and resilience can be very high given other activities that the business wants to invest in. And it's also difficult because we have to keep in mind that no matter how smart we think we are, nature always wins. So we think about design for adaptation not just in adapting to changing climate, but also designing things so that we don't predict the worst possible outcome. We design them so they can be enhanced over time as the probabilities become more clear, as opposed to sinking a whole bunch of money in infrastructure that may not be necessary. Because while we take a lot of things into account, the thing we take most into account is that the future is random and uncertain. It's not determined more than about 5 years out, and our clients really can't afford to make investments that don't add value to their enterprises, whether it's public or private, and reduce risk. I think that's all I want to say at the moment. Except that we in AECOM have started to change our internal conversation so we don't use the term climate change anymore. We use the term climate variation because as we're advising people on investment, we can look around the world and see that if the question is water, it's not a continuous drought or a continuous increase. Sometimes there's too much, sometimes there's too little, and it cycles around. So how we actually can take into account the variability of climate results is going to be, I think, one of the things that will make us competitive in the future, and a number of our competitors are thinking about this as well, because there is no straight line change taking place.
Thank you. So a lot of interesting points raised. I'm going to kind of seize as a first question here about this climate variation versus climate change, which is really an interesting approach. So there is a lot of money to be made in infrastructure. It's a very large market. Actually, the global infrastructure industry is projected to grow about to 3.3 billion in the next 4 years. But you need to contrast that with, in just 2011 alone, global losses from natural disasters totaled 380 billion. So you talked a little bit, Gary, and I just ask everybody to comment here. You talked a little bit about how you are messaging and changing that dialogue with your customers. Can you each comment about how do you contrast a message that there's economic opportunity, in other words, a marketplace, at the same time that you're talking about natural disasters and the human issues that kind of contrast with that? And if I could also ask you to overlay that with thinking about that from a perspective of brownfield versus greenfield projects, so maybe different places across the globe. I just start you off with an example of my former employer. So at ArcelorMittal, they went into a war-torn country, Liberia, and built the site from scratch. So they built transportation, energy, hospitals, all the infrastructure that was needed. But looking at that as a greenfield versus looking at maybe a facility, which I think Raj knows very well from working with the company, in the US might be a 200-year-old brownfield type of facility is very different. So if I could ask you to comment on that.
Yeah, speaking of greenfields is where most of the growth is going to happen, right? If you look at the global market and you look at where most of the population growth is going to be, where most of the need for improvement in quality of life is going to be, it's not going to be in Western Europe or the U.S. It's going to be rest of the world, and we have examples. ArcelorMittal is a customer of ours, and we know that there are steel plants, paper mills, power plants that are perfectly designed, state of the art, zero liquid discharge, zero solid waste, eco-efficient facilities that are on paper, that are permitted, that people are waiting to work at. The raw material, supply chain resources are all lined up except for one thing: water. And these plants, they haven't been able to flip the switch. We have these plants in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. We have these plants in the Caribbean. We have these plants in India. We have these plants in China. And that is the reality with the greenfield situation, is that where there's the most need for growth in industrial activity, the key resources, and this question, and Gary, the point you made about variability, right? I still remember I spoke on World Water Day in Singapore last year, and the day before I left, I get on my flight. New York Times article is about this place called Cherrapunji in northeastern India. I was born and raised in India, and from preschool we learned that it's the wettest place on earth. The article was about how in Cherrapunji for 7 months in the year, the average citizen has to walk close to 5 miles to get the basic water that they need for consumption at home, which is for cooking, not even cleaning, just cooking and drinking water. 5 miles is the average distance for 7 months in a year they have to walk. It goes to the question of variability, and those aspects of variability are going to get very acute. And like it or not, while all the hydrogeological activities on Earth are driven by seasons, almost all human activity has lost all seasonality. Last time I looked, every single tropical vegetable you could imagine you can find at grocery stores in St. Paul, Minnesota, when it's 20 degrees below zero. So our expectation is we don't hibernate anymore, right? Like most other mammals that are of significant size, we don't. We want the same activity all year round everywhere, and that is where the disconnect becomes. And so there's the disconnect between where most of the greenfields are going to be and what resources and disruptions we're going to see. And then there's the disconnect between the variability in all natural cycles and this human expectation that we want to do the same thing 12 months a year.
Well, do you have any thoughts from a communications technology perspective?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I think the way to possibly look at looking at the thing from a financial perspective is to perhaps look at a model where private industry, in concert with big private industry, for lack of any better words, perhaps in concert with some local governments, really look at a different model than what we're used to doing here, especially in the U.S., where we are, financially driven, quota driven, and things like that, and perhaps look at it as a long-term investment. We've certainly been involved in a couple of joint ventures around the world where you invest in building infrastructure as part of a larger team, and you get your returns over many years, 10, 20 years, versus immediate satisfaction and getting it in the immediate quarter upon deployment of any type of solution. We've actually done that with some of Gary's competitors in the engineering construction market, and certainly in the Western world, but also in Eastern Europe. Europe, and I think you're starting to see trends like that now in Asia. Not quite yet in Africa, but I think there's some paranoia about the ability to monetize those investments from a long-term perspective. But I think if some of the big players out there, especially on the infrastructure side, like an AECOM, were to get the appetite to do long-term investing, then a lot of small to middle market players like UltiSat, I think, would follow along and be part of a partnership where you could perhaps monetize something over a long term versus the economic model that we're all used to here in the Western world?
We're actually doing that. We've created AECOM Capital, where we actually will invest, either risk share or invest, and it's a necessary thing. But one thing that Juan Jose and I have talked about is that there's just not going to be enough money available to address these issues in a timely manner. So what we try to do with our clients is get them to actually make adaptation and resilience investments in all of their capital investments, as opposed to thinking there needs to be a separate fund. So let's say you increase the cost of this by 5% and you have an asset then that the risk is much lower, those sorts of things. Because unless you can have somebody at the table every time you're making a decision, an investment decision, that's representing the adaptation and resilience perspective, you're not going to make the progress that you need to make in order to address these issues of climate variability.
So Gary, if I can just follow up with that, do you see that being embedded in government regulation eventually?
I think that there are going to be some early adopters that are going to gain competitive advantage because people are going to see that those companies' assets are better protected, and there'll be some people who don't want to follow, and I think that there'll be some regulatory issues that come up. But I don't. In Europe, perhaps it could come from a regulatory perspective since they're taking these issues more seriously. In the local governments in the U.S., I could see this happening a little bit, just like most of the states now have state laws saying that a certain amount of the total power needs to be coming from green sources. They could just as easily say that a certain percentage of every public project has to have an adaptation and resilience component. We're working with the Federal Highway Administration on assessing all of their assets so that they can start making those kinds of decisions rolling into their capital planning, those sorts of things. FEMA is also starting to think about this. It's only been this year, I think, that FEMA was actually allowed to take future probabilities into account when they were doing their planning. Before, they could only use historical evidence. So we have a long way to go in order to get there, but I think we'll make some progress. But some Western nation is going to have to get hit really hard, I think, before people start taking this very seriously.
I see Joannes looking to comment, and then I want to make sure to give folks time to ask questions out there too. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I guess my perspective is that building for resiliency is much cheaper than not considering it. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the major events that have impacted the United States have been essentially bailed out by the government in terms of both personal property and other properties, et cetera. And whether it's through litigation or through payments by FEMA. And I think if you take that out of the equation and start charging real premiums, which FEMA has started to do against a lot of complaining across the country, then all of a sudden your resiliency that you would build into your infrastructure becomes a lot more attractive.
Do we have questions from the audience? Well, Raj, I think
I'll jump in. I wanted to make one comment about government regulations, right? I mean, at a very abstract level, even if you look at all environmental regulations, it's an interesting, intriguing idea, right? Are we going to have climate adaptation related. I mean, we don't have climate mitigation related action that's driven through government regulations to expect something in terms of adaptation driven by government regulations. If we look at it, air pollution, water pollution, everything, it's basically government regulations are there to force the private sector to internalize externalities, the social and environmental costs that the private sector doesn't voluntarily do. Interestingly, if you look at what's happening out there, particularly with the major corporations, the idea of valuing natural capital, the idea of triple bottom line accounting, the idea of true value accounting for water and energy, recognizing a beverage company recognizing that while they might spend tens of thousands of dollars a year on water at a beverage plant, if they had to shut that business down, someone made the point about opportunity cost, it will be running in the millions, and they actually and once companies, private sector starts putting dollar signs in front of anything, we know how to plan. I mean, that is the piece, right? We've been dealing with anything that has dollar signs in front of it. We have been planning for centuries around it. It's only when that dollar sign is missing that we are not able to. And I think the private sector is starting to put dollar signs in front of these long-term issues, at least internally, if not public investor facing, at least internally, a lot of the big private sector is starting to do it. And that's very critical because we talk about government dysfunction, we say, oh, they're caught by the 4-year election cycle. Let's face it, the private sector is caught by the 3-month quarterly financial statement reporting cycle, which is even less strategic than a 4-year election cycle. So, but behind the scenes, one thing that is happening is this valuing natural capital. And I think some of it, hopefully, in an optimistic perspective, will make these government regulations redundant, actually.